Thank you everyone for joining us. This is the second session of a virtual book club devoted to Henry's comics and stuff. Today's session is going to focus on chapters 2 through 5, the Collecting Stories unit. I'm your moderator, Drew Morton. I'm an associate professor at Texas A&M University in Texarkana. I wrote a book called Panel to the Screen, which is about style in American comics. Joining us today, of course, are the man of the hour, Henry Jenkins, Provost Professor of Communication, Journalism, Cinematic Art, and Education at the University of Southern California. He is the author and editor of 20 books on various aspects of media and popular culture. Among them are Textual Poachers, Convergence Culture, Popular Culture and the Civic Imagination, and of course, Comics and Stuff. On the panel today, we have Bryan Talbot, who has written and drawn comics and graphic novels for over 40 years, including Judge Dredd, Batman, Sandman, The Tale of One Bad Rat, Alice in Sunderland, Daughter of Her Father's Eyes, written with his wife Mary Talbot, and 5 volumes of his Granville series of steampunk detective thrillers. He is published in over 20 countries, as a frequent guest at international comic festivals, and has been awarded an honorary doctorate in arts and an honorary doctorate in letters, and elected a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Up next is Lincoln Geraghty, professor of media cultures in the School of Film, Media and Communication at the University of Portsmouth in the United Kingdom. His major publications include Living with Star Trek, American Culture and the Star Trek Universe, American Science Fiction Film and Television, and Cult Collectors, Nostalgia, Fandom, and Collecting Popular Culture. So thank you for joining us, Lincoln. Up next is Jared Gardner. Jared is professor of English and director of the Popular Culture Studies at Ohio State University, where he spends all the time he can at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum. Why wouldn't you? He is the author and editor of a few books on comics, including Projections, Comics, and History of 21st Century Storytelling. Up next is Bart Beaty, author and editor and translator of more than 20 books in the field of comic studies, including 12 Cent Archie, Comics versus Art, and he is the general editor of the Critical Survey of Graphic Novels and lead researcher on What Were the Comics Project. Sorry, mouthfuls. William Proctor is up next, principal lecturer in comics, film, and transmedia at Bournemouth University. He's the co-editor of the books Transmedia Earth, Global Convergence Cultures, and the award-winning Disney Star Wars Forces of Production, Promotion, and Reception. Billy is the leading expert on the history and theory of reboots and currently preparing his debut monograph on the topic for publication, Reboot Culture, Comics, Film, and Transmedia. He is also published widely on a broad array of subjects, including Batman, James Bond, Stephen King, Star Trek, and Star Wars, and other forms of popular culture, and he is the co-editor of the forthcoming edited collection Horror Franchise Cinema. He is also associate editor of Confessions of an Aka Fan. Behind the scenes today, I just want to put out a thank you to Amanda Ford and Joan Miller for kind of letting people into the chat and moderating audience questions, which we'll get to predominantly at the end for the last 20 or 30 minutes. So please reserve those for the end and put them in the chat. If Joan and Amanda could get to those, we'll get to them at the end. So thank you all for joining us. I don't think I forgot any bookkeeping at the front end. I'll remind everyone about the next session at the end, but let's start off with a question that I hope doesn't suck up too much oxygen in the room, but gets everyone kind of up to speed with what we discussed last week, which is, what are comics to you and how did you start to think about them in terms of their materiality?
Materiality. Can I say something?
Of course.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I think they're nice. I try and make my books be nice sort of artifacts, nice things to hold. The Granville books are cloth bound, they're embossed, they got nice end papers, they're tactile. One of the things we try to combat against in the comic industry is, of course, piracy. Because as soon as you have something published, 2 minutes later, it's free. People can download it off the web. So it's a way of trying to combat that. If something nice you can put on your table or on your bookshelf and look at it, it's something that you want to own.
Yeah, I've always been interested, actually, thinking about that in the way in which, for the most part, the comics industry, unlike music and movie industry, has turned a relative blind eye to digital piracy. And I do think that's partly because, as Bryan suggests, these are objects we want to hold, and that I know lots of people who download through, less than legitimate places, lots of comics. And unlike my students who are fans of movies and music, they almost always end up becoming collectors of material comics. And that is itself a kind of fascinating phenomenon, a kind of digital resistance, even as comics are doing amazing things in the digital sphere, a kind of investment in materiality and the form, which is kind of fascinating given that comics have moved across so many different media and so many different forms, and have kind of reinvented themselves numerous times. I'm right now in the beginning of a project that's trying to think about comics before comics, kind of from caricature in the 17th century up through the kind of beginning of the period in which cartoonists began calling themselves cartoonists around the middle of the 19th century, and kind of thinking about that as a way of thinking in terms that might step outside of our 20th and 21st century definitions of comics. I don't know yet fully what that's going to open up, but I'm increasingly realizing that going back to the 17th century, this kind of larger object that we might call kind of cartooning or cartoon artifacts seems to always involve the kind of three ingredients of cheap paper print available, which begins really in the 17th century with some of the earliest caricature prints that were floating around Bologna and elsewhere. The use of what was then called caricature or later cartooning, approach to kind of line and subject, and a kind of relationship to audience that involves or encourages a kind of what we would in our own time call gaming or interactivity. Obviously, terms that would not be used back then, but that encouraged audiences to do material things with comics or caricature back then. And in fact, some of the earliest design board games, as I've kind of come to learn, were created by some of the earliest caricatures. So I think there's something there, but it's too early for me to offer a kind of transhistorical definition yet.
Yeah, a lot of the British ones were political in nature. The political broadsheets that they'd hand out on the street to try and convince people of the views. I mean, Rawlinson did quite a few.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to the materiality of comics, it's something that I never ever thought about at all until digital comics came into existence. And when I started to read, when I tried digital comics, I mean, they look great on an iPad, the backlit. I really hate it. I don't like it. And that's when I started to think about materiality. And I was speaking last week about how I ordered, because I've been doing a lot of research on the Silver Age recently of mainly superhero stuff. And that when I got a superhero comic, my partner watched me take it out, stroke it, and then open the pages and smell the pages. Mm. Now, one of the reasons why I sniff the pages is I used to be a paper boy back in the 80s, early 80s. So it kind of catapults me back to that time when you go into a newsagent and smell all the ink and all of that. But there's just something very tactile about holding a comic. It's different to a book. I'm only speaking about me. I mean, everyone's different. But now thanks to Henry and other people doing works on materiality, when I pick something up, it's always at the forefront of my mind. I think digital comics are great for the younger generation. Although, as an aside, I would say before the pandemic, when I was doing a session on comics at university, I was struck immediately by the amount of students that were asking me how to read a comic. Now, for me, and I remember talking to you about this, Bryan, comics was something that you read comics at such an early age that this is how you learn to read. Mm. And it was the same for me. So comics were in my youth, Henry's youth, probably everyone here. For my students, not so. I mean, the British industry has been a shadow of its former self. And I grew up in the 1970s where I didn't know it at the time, of course, but we were witnessing either the end of an industry, but we also witnessed a great renaissance with comics like Action in 2000 AD, which were very politically seditious. And Bryan was involved in that landscape at the time with his work in near myths and such. So I just find it interesting that the younger generation might have lost something. I am generalising widely, but it's a different world. They would rather read a digital comic if they read a comic at all.
I don't think it's just young people, you know. I mean, when the first book I did with Barry, you know, Daughter of Her Father's Eyes, when it was nominated for a Costa Biography Award, Mary was interviewed on BBC by John Humphreys, you know, the political guy. He said to her, how do I actually read a comic? And he was 50s or 60s, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't on the interview. I'd have said, you buy one, that'd be a good start, you know.
Yeah.
I mean,
buy this one.
I don't understand what they mean when they say I can't read comics. I mean, my granddaughters can read comics. I mean, it's not rocket science. I mean, it's I'm sure if they tried, within 3 or 4 pages, they get the hang of it. You know, it's not a hard thing to do.
Yeah, all good comics teach you how to read them if you just take the time and listen to the work. It'll tell you how to read it.
If the storytelling is good, yeah.
Yeah, I think
Last week,
I think it's the same about. I know how to read comics because I've always read comics, and that's kind of tautological in itself. But it's kind of like when someone says, "How would you define a comic?" Well, usually as little as often, because I know what a comic is. We know it when we see it, right? But also, I don't want to go into with formalist. I mean, we've got people like great scholars like Bart and everyone who can tell me what a comic is. But yeah, anyway, I've spoken enough.
last week, in this materialism discussion, we talked a little bit about Chris Ware, and I happen to have one of my Chris Ware books with me, and I just kind of wanted to show some of the ways that he uses materiality. For the first, this is the book without the dust jacket, which I just love that image. And then one of the things I found really, really fascinating is, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a comic on the binding of the book, and you have to flip it over in order to read the other half. And then my favorite page in here is this one, which is a constellation map that actually glows in the dark. And you can feel, it's like, obviously you guys can't feel it through the screen, but there's a texture to it, and I can feel the raised parts where all the constellations will be once you turn the lights off and look at it in the dark. So I just thought this was really cool, and I would share it with you guys.
So Bart, you've been
book.
trying to get in here, so I want to make sure that we hear from you.
Sure. It's interesting. I gave up on the question of what are comics a few years ago. I had come out of writing comics versus art, and I think I kind of laid out my view of the comics world in that, but then wanted to come back. I was very interested at that time in edge cases and these kind of liminal cases of cartoonists trying to do things that weren't traditionally comics. I had been at the Angoulême Festival, and they had a series of dance performances done by cartoonists, choreographed by cartoonists. And then I'd seen Art Spiegelman had done a work with the Palabos dance troupe in New York called Happy Hooligans Still Moving, where they combined comics and dance. And I thought, can you dance to comics? Can you perform comics on the radio? What would that look like? Can you sculpt comics? All of these sorts of things. And I became kind of interested in that, and it never materialized as the book that I envisioned, partly because of the conference once and giving a talk about Dave McKean work, and that nobody had seen. And I thought, well, this is kind of weird. I'm just talking about these weird examples that no one's ever seen. And I started to want to move away from what are comics, or what comics could be, to the title of my new project, what were comics. And that project is a survey of the development of the American comic book format from 1934 to 2014, where we made a list of every comic book published in the United States during that period and then randomly sampled them and took 2% of all the comics published in every year and then bought them. The comics behind me are literally, these are the 3,653 randomly selected comics. And the first one, the number one from 1934, I'll hold it up, is this. This is an issue of Gulf Funny Weekly. I can't remember which week. It's a week, it'll say on here somewhere. But it's a single page. I mean, this is it. It's one page folded to create 4 pages, which you can then fold again in that way. And it was a giveaway for Gulf gas stations. It's 4 pages. It's got 4 stories. And that gives birth to an industry that is producing works that are 68 pages long, often with more than 100 stories, because they're reprinting Sunday newspaper strips, often that have 2 stories on the page, a topper and the main strip, and so on. And we're very interested in how does an industry move from producing 68-page anthologies where you're producing dozens of stories to, in 2014, a norm where you have a 32-page document, a 32-page codex that has one 20-page story that is usually part of a longer narrative. What are the steps that have been taken along the road to enable that to happen? And so it's not really what comics could be or what their edge cases are, but what typically were they at any given point in time? So what did comic books look like in 1957, and what did they look like in 1977, and how were those different, and what were the kind of industrial changes and artistic changes, aesthetic changes that brought that about? So the materiality becomes incredibly important. I think if we do have digital copies now of all this, we've made digital copies for our research assistants, but when I look at the comics on the shelf, I can actually see there's an issue of the Lone Ranger over here that actually has, sort of like the Chris Ware example, has something on the spine is almost like a poem. It describes a puma. I'm like, well, if we just had a scan of that, would we even know that that text was there? Because the scans that I've seen online don't happen to have the scans of the spines. And so the presence, the physical materiality of our individual copies becomes really important for us in looking at what we're trying to look at.
Something I want to pick up on is, for me, 2 things. What is comics to me? I think it's a time thing. I'm interested in nostalgia and collecting predominantly within the field. And comics to me meant summer holidays. I don't know if the same for Billy, but I would start seeing the summer compilations of the Beano and Dandy on newsagent shelves. So I knew that the summer holidays were here and there was no more school. So I guess that was light relief, and looking forward to be able to read them when I don't have any schoolwork to do. So that to me brings up nostalgic sort of memories of youth and the comics I enjoyed reading when I wasn't at school. And I suppose the materiality question is interesting. In researching the book called Collectors, going to Comic-Con in San Diego for 4 years, materiality came to me in the shape of an entire stall in the floor of the convention center dedicated to selling comic book safes. So you could store your comic book in a impregnable storage device that the owner of the stall and the designer of the safe assured everyone that was interested in buying it would stand up to fire, floods, alien invasion, earthquakes, moths, wood lice, termites, everything. And this was tucked aside stalls where people were thumbing through, the vast numbers of comics that were being sold in the floor. But there was a space for a safe guy and also an insurance salesman where you could sign up and insure your collection, and that was on the floor of Comic-Con. So I think that reminded me about the materiality and also the sort of financial investment that comics symbolize for all those collectors.
So a while back, we had a guest on my podcast called Matthew Shiffrin, who was a blind fan activist. And one of his current projects is to create comics for the blind that is using sound and haptics to communicate the experience of a Daredevil comic, and he's been getting permission from various Daredevil writers to adapt their work to that form. And we might argue that adapting an existing comic story to that medium is maybe not the best way of exploring what its formal affordances are, but it raises to me this question of how, you know, if we strip away materiality, if we strip away the visual, is there something called a comic that still exists? And for him, he's very emphatic that these are comics. I'm not sure, and consistent with his experience of comics, where comics from a kid were read to him and described to him, but not something he could see and directly experience. So I throw that open as another example of current shifts around the materiality of comics. It's not just digital comics, but it may be one step beyond, where augmented reality with stereoscopic sound and haptic patterning could become the experience some people have of what a comic story is.
Yeah, I remember a number of years ago, I saw, and it was fairly early in the kind of experimentations with digital comics, but Damien Duffy and John Jennings were experimenting with a kind of 3D comic you could walk through that was projected. I don't know, I think they eventually kind of moved away from the project, but it was the very concept of it, to think about what would be a comic you could literally travel through, kind of picking up on Hilary Schute's conception of comics as site-specific installations, was really interesting, and actually kind of, to me, it worked as they kind of described and presented it at a conference I was at with them. But I think those kinds of questions are some of the most exciting and provocative ones, because they force us to kind of expand some of the often fairly rigid definitions we have. I think one of the things that's hurt comic studies to some degree, although it's also produced some great work, is an obsessive desire to protect and preserve comics as something unique and special that needs to be kind of kept separate from film, and kept separate from toys, and kept separate from children's literature, even though it's all part of this larger stew. And I think that often does a disservice to our kind of understanding of comics, both in terms of their materiality and also in terms of the kind of culture of comics. So I like projects and thought experiments that force us to kind of think about what comics are beyond simply, you know, saddle-stitched volumes or other kind of material forms that we're comfortable with.
Have you ever heard of a comic called She Lives?
No.
By Woodrow Phoenix.
No.
It's, Woodrow has been doing comics for some while. He's done quite a few comics, including Rumble Strip, you might have heard of.
Yeah.
Anyway, he produced this comic, it's about 3 foot, 4 foot high,
right.
hardback. It only exists in one form. It's not reprinted. It's just the original artwork.
Oh, wow.
And he did the entire graphic novel like that. And the only way you can see it, the only way you can read it, is he gives presentations and he turns the pages and takes you through the story. And I've seen him do it several times. In fact, I've got him on here in Sunderland to do it. He did it at the Cartoon Museum in London. But I think that's quite a unique thing, and physicality of comics. I think, I'm not sure there's anything like that exists.
But
the only thing I can think of is Chris Ware's Building Stories.
Yeah.
The thing where you take it out of the box. I mean, I've used that with students to talk about hypertext, things like that. You know, this is kind of like the internet without the internet. And I find that fascinating. So this comic that you're talking about, Bryan, couldn't make him any money.
No, well, he does get fees sometimes for showing it, for presenting it.
Yeah, it's almost like a chalk talk, which again is kind of, you know, where a lot of cartoonists and modern cartooning comes out of, the kind of, you know, church and lecture hall and vaudeville chalk talks where cartooning would be performance, and not about a kind of material work that people would take home. And I think, again, that's part of that stew that these kinds of experiments that you're describing, Bryan, allow us to think about and recover, because they're lost.
If you do a search for She Lives,
I will.
It's a reference to the title, to the line in Bride of Frankenstein. By Woodrow Phoenix, you'll find it, I'm sure. It'll be something about it. But I just thought when I was saying that about depends what you define as comics, because Scott McCloud will define anything as comics basically. But I actually did here where I live in town. There's a 230 meter long strip of pavement, black granite pavement that goes throughout the square in the middle of the city that I designed, and it's basically the history of Sunderland in pictures and the names of ships built on the Ware. And it is sequential pictures of, the history of Sunderland. That only exists in one form, these granite paving blocks. Now, whether you think that's a comic, I don't know.
Well, I had a chance to talk to David Mack of Kabuki fame some years back. And he comes out of an art school tradition of artist books, which are also unique objects that explore what a book could be. And he thinks of the printed version of his comics as artifacts or byproducts of the creation of an artist book, and then ultimately canvases of the individual pages, which he sells, and says he ultimately makes a lot more money selling the individual pages than he does selling this, whether it's the Marvel comics he does or his own independent published work. So for him, the comic itself is simply a necessary part of a process, the end part of a process, where he's much more interested in the intermediate phase of that process.
Aren't they also important marketing tools? I'm just struck by Bart's, the golfing comic that he advertising as a form of advertising. I'm thinking back to childhood. Comics came with every He-Man figure I bought as a way of imagining you entering that world. You read the comic and then played with the figure and continued the battle transmedially from page to back garden and such. And even Lego play sets come with mini comics, particularly tied into the DC and Marvel lines that they have. So comics are still very much important part of marketing, and I'm sure the artists get, as you're saying, get probably paid more for producing this sort of mass produced material that comes with Lego sets than they might possibly do with some of their own work.
Greg Highland, who produces the Lego Batman comics for those Lego sets, noted to me once that he is the most read contemporary Batman artist because the Lego sets sell tremendously more than the Batman comics do. Nobody knows his name.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
That point makes me kind of think about this idea that you've kind of been considering for a while, which is how does canon formation kind of work, and how does it evolve in the progression of comics?
I think canon formation, I mean, obviously I've written about this fairly extensively, and it's one of my hobby horses, but I was talking yesterday about EC comics, and I think when we look, for instance, at the history of the comic book in the United States in the 1950s and the code tends to get written around a debate between Wortham and Bill Gaines, particularly at the Senate hearings, and driving EC out of business and so on. That's partly because Gaines was active in speaking to fans, but it's also because EC comics, more than any comics from the 1950s, were taken up and repackaged by fans in the 1970s. And so you have this kind of initial fanzine, almost republications of that material, then those kind of glorious box sets, then Dark Horse has been doing them, Fantagraphics has been doing. I mean, we have two publishers right now that are releasing EC collections in different ways, one by the title and one by the author, which presents EC as this very important force in the 1950s, that they weren't really. They were a fairly marginal publisher. I mean, if you look at EC relative to DC or to Dell, they're a very minor figure. But when I was writing my book on Wortham in the late 90s and publishing it in the early 2000s, that's what we had available to us. And so it was the publishing decisions that were made by people that were going to keep material in print. We can only write on, we can only study, we can only teach that which is in print. We know from our colleagues in film that they've lost 90% of silent films ever be made. We know from our friends in classics departments that we have, almost nothing from the Greeks. I mean, we have these very small number of texts from Greek and Roman times and so on. And so that shapes how we understand things. I think going back to the discussion of digital comics, it's been fascinating that now we have Comic Book Plus and Digital Comics Museum and other sources where people have been scanning all the non-EC horror comics, all the non-EC crime comics, all the romance comics, and so on. And now you look and think, wow, this really changes A, how we can study comics, and B, how we teach them. So in my own course, I teach a course on the American comic book from 1934 to 1962. And I have students randomly assigned a horror comic. They get a horror title and they're told, go to Digital Comics Museum, go to Comic Book Plus, and read the run of this title and read it. And we'll read 3 chapters from Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent. And it's, well, Wortham claims X, Y, and Z. Do you find evidence to support his claims or not? And it's fascinating. They all do these presentations, and half of them are like, this Wortham guy, he's a complete idiot. Like, these comics aren't so bad, but the comic I have, it's not even scary. There's nothing really going on in it. And half of them are like, this Wortham guy totally undersold how horrible these things are. They're so racist, they're so sexist, they're so misogynist. It's like, why are we not talking about Fox comics and how, how contemptible they are? I can't believe they used to sell these things to little kids. And they're just like, this Wortham guy, like, he needed to really ramp up his attacks on the comic book industry.
Oh my word.
Can I just tag on that, just because I of course, love the work you've done in Wortham. It's been really influential for me. And, I do think I love EC, of course, but I love EC partly because it is an exception. And it's the exception that really inspired, the underground cartoonists, people like Spiegelman and Crumb obviously grew up being fans of an EC that they hardly even knew in their own childhoods, and then kind of made zines about it. And then, as you said, it became reprinted and canonized. But it was this kind of progressive vision of the kind of horror and crime comics that could be held up to show that Wortham was just a crank. But as you said, if you send students into those archives that are now available to them and actually see what some of these comics looked like, they're going to discover some things that will make them think Wortham was onto something. And that's, I think, important, right? We can for the first time, as Bart's saying, kind of encourage students to do their own revisionist archival history. Hopefully one day we'll start to get more scholarship about what Bart has also kind of taught us, what were the most widely read comics and cartoons then, and continue to be the most widely read comics today, and also the most understudied, which is comics for kids. We've been so desperate to pretend that comics are only for adults that we've erased that part of the history. And as we all know, right now, Scholastic's graphics imprint is selling more comics than Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, and Image combined. And yet, find the scholarship on it. It's not there.
Yeah, I think the idea, while I agree with what you're saying about Wortham and getting students to look at the content of comics during the time, I think there's a danger that they can look at comics with 21st century eyes from the period, and the context is lost. I'm not trying to defend the comics. I mean, sometimes, even especially in superhero comics, I got a great one the other day, Silver Age one, and I'm sure many people have heard of it, which is the case of the disabled Justice League. And it's all the Justice League are rendered disabled in this episode. And you can tell their thoughts, they have good intentions behind it. But it's horrific. It's kind of leads into this kind of super crip stereotype. And it's the same, I'm sure we all know the comic about when Lois Lane turns black for a day. Through a quirk of science fiction imagination. And when you read it now, it's kind of like a gasp. I can't believe they did this. But at the time, they were trying to be progressive. They failed miserably, but they were trying their best. So I'm kind of, I agree with what you're saying, but at the same time, I worry that everything from before the 1980s, maybe even later, would be deemed as indefensible if we look at them with millennial eyes. I guess that's what I'm saying.
So all of the people here on the panel are people that really inspired me in one way or another as I was working on comic stuff. But Jared, you had written about the archival impulses of some of the comic artists, including Kim Deesh and Seth, who I ended up writing about in the book. And maybe it's worth making the connection from where we're at now, the building up of a canon, to the kinds of arguments you were making about the archival practices that resulted in the content of some of these comics. So could you make some of those connections?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of wonderful, kind of amazing thing for me about reading your book is kind of seeing kind of how you kind of are able to draw out and read so beautifully some of the things that I was only kind of gesturing at or kind of having a vague sense of back in kind of 2010 when I was writing a lot of that material. One of the things that I've always just been fascinated, as you describe really nicely in the book, about this world, and in addition to the examples you focus on, of course, you know, Chris Ware's Rusty Brown came out after your book, obviously, but that would be an interesting one to explore in this context as well. You touch a little bit on Ben Catcher, but there's whole worlds of fictional kind of archives and explorations in there. In fact, the more, as you know, you and I have talked about in the past, the more you start looking for it, the more you start to find this kind of impulse everywhere in comics. And part of what I've always kind of found fascinating about it is, and it's a point I'm almost sure you make this point a couple times in the book, is it seems as if these cartoonists are kind of offering a kind of model of an alternative model of historiography for all of us. One that is kind of encouraging us to kind of explore comics and the things that make comics by stepping outside of comics. So, you know, we see postcards, for example, in Clyde Fans. We see action figures, obviously, in Rusty Brown. We see old horror comics and horror magazines in My Favorite Things Are Monsters, and so on. And the kind of ways in which these collections are built up, and many of them are based on fictional archives. The world of Kim Deitch, for example, it's often sometimes based on real figures, but often based on children's television shows and animations of the past, some of which are fantastical and made up, some of which are based quite closely on real popular culture history of the past. But all of it seems to be encouraging and kind of has inspired me in my own research to kind of step outside of the kind of stereotype, which I think is often a false stereotype to begin with, of comics fans and collectors as these completists who have to get every issue in mint condition of a series, put it in bags and boards, and kind of ossify it in amber. And instead to kind of encourage the intuition, the kind of impulses of the time traveler, and even the conspiracy theorist who's trying to kind of map out connections that might not be at first available or possible. And to me, that's been, I feel like a lot of what I've learned as a scholar who works with historical popular culture really has come from thinking through these kinds of methods that kind of these cartoonists, frankly, have kind of made so attractive, often in their fictional dumpster diving that they represent in books like Clyde Fans or It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken. And it's something that in particular I think is useful for us in teaching and thinking about popular culture more generally, because of course one of our challenges is the popular culture of our own present. We can feel its beating heartbeat, right? Its living heat is very palpable to us, but we can't see its patterns. It's too close. We can't see its larger shape of the archive. When we go back and do popular culture research, we can see the shape of the archive. We could even start to map out some patterns and do distant reading, but we can't feel, at least on our first forays, any heartbeat or life heat. It's too far away. And so part of what this kind of methodology that these cartoonists suggest for me is something that I try and teach my students, which is you have to kind of imaginatively immerse yourself in the popular culture of the past until you can start to bring that heartbeat back to life. And then for the first time, you'll be able to connect the patterns with the kind of energies that fans and creators of the time kind of invested in these forms. And from there, we might be able to then time travel back to the present and actually begin to see some of the shapes and patterns, not to get too conspiracy theory minded here, in our own present popular culture, which by definition often, for many of us, not for you, Henry, but certainly for me, kind of overwhelms us and makes it impossible to see what is happening in the moment. For me, I've always struggled with understanding my own popular culture, and therefore I've taken recourse in the popular culture of the past. And I think that's true for many of these cartoonists as well. But part of what I hope to take from those studies is a better way of understanding and seeing what's happening in the popular culture of our present.
If you don't mind, I'd like to
apologize.
If you guys don't mind, I'd like to try to see how we might make this a little more tangible and accessible, and maybe see if Bryan would speak a little bit about how his aesthetic evolved from something very multimodal in Alice in Sunderland to his kind of more steampunk work in Granville, and especially his use of the Cabinet of Curiosity, which, you know, brings about all these conversations we're already having about collecting and accumulating in popular memory. So I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to bring up two stills. And Bryan, if you'd like to share some thoughts on that, we'd really like to hear them. Oh, can the host enable screen sharing for me? Sorry.
Oh, yes. Let me see what I need to do here. Sorry.
It's all right.
There we go. Let's see. That's my screen share. Okay. Multiple participants can share simultaneously.
There it goes. Thank you. It should be up.
There we go.
Can you all see? Okay. Yeah, so Bryan, what drew you to change styles? How did you even consider the composition on the left? How would you even start approaching that as a comics artist?
Well, it's basically looking at the cabinet, you know, it's a photograph of the cabinet, and as you can see,
you're still engaging in compositional technique, right? You're still, okay.
Well, part of the skill, I suppose, of comic storytelling is how you lead the eye around the page. I mean, the Cabinet of Curiosity is there. I mean, we've got it basically because when we moved into this house, this cabinet was there, empty. And I already had a lot of this junk, so I just put it in there. I mean, some of the things I've had in there since childhood, you know, the Laurel and Hardy salt and pepper shaker were my parents, you know. I picked stuff up. I picked the Chairman Mao badge up in China. I picked the Nixon's the One badge up at San Diego, you know. The cherub with the gun, actually, it's by a sculptor called Moving Jim. It's called Moving Jim because of these sculptures that move. But that was a piece of body furniture he actually designed, which is it's a Renaissance cherub with an M16 machine gun. But yeah, I mean, I think get back to what you're asking. The question is, I've done this all my career. I've always adapted my drawing style, my storytelling style, to suit the sort of story being told. I know there's a lot of comic artists you can pick up. They can do a story about anything. You pick it up, it's drawn in the same style. I've always tried to do a comic in the style, the drawing style that I think is totally appropriate to the subject matter. And I thought that with Granville, this sort of detective thriller, anthropomorphic thing, it sort of suited quite a slick, so European style, comic style, almost, you know, clear line, like Hergé with Tintin, you know. But if you look at something, for example, like The Daughter of a Father's Eyes, the books I've done with Mary, you know, you'll see that that's drawn in a very different sort of style. You know, the Daughter of Her Father's Eyes is done very small scale with a soft pencil and watercolor wash in a different drawing style where people just have dots for eyes. So, yeah, I mean, with Alice, that sort of seemed, because there was all this rich information I was trying to get across, it seemed a good way to do it, and sort of collaging effect. Because the thing is, I mean, it's that one of the reviews said that Alice would have been unreadable if it had been done in another medium, and I think this is true, because one of the things that comics can do really well, that better than a lot of other media, is to get across very complex information very directly and very, you know, immediately with this mixture of words and pictures. You can, as I think you said in the Henry in the book, it sort of goes in through two channels. You know, you read the text in a linear manner, but the eye, while it's looking at it, can't help yourself. You scan the page. It's zooming all over the place. You're taking not only the page you're looking at, you're taking the page opposite as well, which is why I always design comics at 2 pages at a time. I always design them to be seen as a whole, the 2 pages, because that's what your eye does. You know, I mean, I've heard French comic academics call it glissage. It's the way your eye sort of skates across from one image to another. So while you're reading it in a linear way, the text, you're taking everything in, which is why it's important to know which pages face each other, you know, because, I mean, the number of times I've been reading a comic and there's been a question posed here, or a mystery here on the left-hand side. And you can see these, you know, somebody's saying, I wonder who the secret identity of such a body is. And you can see it on the other side, the guy taking the mask off. And you're going, what? You know, you save that over the page. You save over the page to change a scene, if possible, to change an atmosphere. You can encapsulate the whole atmosphere between 2 pages by the use of colour and layout and all sorts of things. Turn the page, you can have a completely different colour palette and a completely different layout style, and suddenly the atmosphere is very different. You know, you can manipulate the reader's perception of the story by the way you lay out the comic and the way you tell the story visually.
I think that's why in digital comics, where you can zoom in and all of that, if you're on a mobile phone or something, I think that's what you can lose, Brian, is that
I know, yeah.
Looking at the whole page, and you know, we've all turned a page and seen a massive Kirby splash, and it's like, especially as a kid, you're just like, oh, something like that. So I appreciate the composition that you're talking about. That takes a lot of thought. Sorry, Henry.
Yep.
So Brian, Billy and I and Mary and you were sitting in the room you're sitting in now, and had a conversation where I was asking you about collecting, and I'm looking at the masks behind you on the wall and thinking this house is full of incredibly interesting stuff. And you were very insistent then, and were in recent correspondence with me, that you're not a collector, you're an accumulator. And I just wanted to ask you to elaborate on that a bit more in this context.
Well, I'm not, I mean, with comics, I've been buying comics since I was a kid, but I've never been a completist, unless there was a story I was missing in an essential chapter, you know, I needed to follow the story. No, I just, I think you mentioned in the book the thing about stamp collecting. I had to go stamp collecting when I was a kid, and I gave it up very quickly when I realised I was never going to get every stamp in the world, you know. It's something impossible to do. So I'm like that with everything. I mean, these masks, I started with these. In fact, the one there, Lincoln, on your wall, I've got a very similar one, the Venice Carnival mask, just like that over there. It started when I saw some Hindu deities in a shop in London. I knew the guy who owns the shop. And I said, oh, they're lovely, those masks. And he said, I've got 3 in the last consignment that were damaged. They're only made out of paper, you know, papier-mâché. If you can repair them, you can have them. And I said, yeah, sure. So he gave them to me, and they're up here on the wall. And I rebuilt the faces with paper mache on the inside and dabs of paint, looked good as new. Stuck them on the wall, and I think next birthday or something, at least 2 people bought me a mask for a birthday present. I started being given them, you know, and after that, I have actually picked up 1 or 2. I think I picked this one up. It's a Brazilian one. I picked that up in Brazil, and the Venice ones that we got in Venice. But yeah, a lot of them have come as presents. So I didn't actually set out to collect masks, and a lot of the stuff I have is the same. You saw that cabinet of curiosities. I mean, there's not much similarity between each thing in there. It's just interesting stuff.
Yeah, and even like if you think about Bart's project, I mean, a lot of it is about, Bart, tell me if I'm wrong, but a lot of it is about the kind of arbitrary selection, right? This is kind of a kind of cross section that actually, partly through its randomness, tells us more about what comics were than any completist run of any one title could possibly do.
Yeah,
I think a lot of us are serial collectors like that. Sorry, yeah, please.
I was at, when I was buying the comics, I was at WonderCon in Anaheim a few years ago. I was talking to Harley Yee, who's a very well-known comic dealer. And I was kind of going through his bins, and he said, well, I had my list of the comics I was still looking for. And he said, well, what are you looking for? I said, well, it's random. Like, I can't really tell you I'm looking for, whatever this particular romance comic or that. He said, well, let me see the list. I know what my stock is. And I said, he looked at the list and he said, like, what is this? What is the logic? I've never seen this, because people want all the work of a certain title. They want a certain character, of a certain artist, a certain writer. That's all makes sense to someone like him. He says, this makes no sense. I said, well, it's literally random. It was generated by a random number generator online from an Excel spreadsheet. And he looked at it for a few seconds and he said, this is really random. And I said, thank you. Like, it was, thank you. That's exactly, it is totally randomly generated. And what we're finding is that if you look at if you look at a comic from 1950, that across these companies, they look somewhat similar. They're the same number of pages, they have the same number of stories, the stories are the same length, they tend to be 5 or 6 pages, tend to get 5 or 6 page stories of different genres, different types, and so on. And that becomes something where we're trying to map the typical so that we can then go back and map the atypical. Like, if we go back to the EC example, this is kind of atypical. I mean, the humanities generally focuses on the atypical. When we teach Shakespeare not as, oh, he's fairly typical as Elizabethan dramatist. It's like, no, he's the best, right? And if you study Elizabethan drama, you can make arguments about why Shakespeare is better than his contemporaries and so on, but we're only going to give our students the best ones. We'll give them the best painters, we'll give them the best musicians, we'll give them the best writers, but we tend to focus on things that are unlike everything else. I mean, what could be less typical 20th century writing than Ulysses by Joyce? And, but we dedicate entire courses to that. Well, Joyce only looks unusual relative to the other writers of the 1920s and 30s. I've had this experience of teaching Kirby to a generation of students who were born in the 21st century who look and they just don't see it. They don't see Kirby's innovation because everything after Kirby is based on Kirby. And so I'm like, if you look at all of these DC comics from the superhero comics from the 1950s with there's kind of stayed layouts and so on, and then look at Kirby, you go, oh yes, now I get it. But from today's standpoint, Kirby doesn't look revolutionary. Elvis doesn't sound revolutionary. Everything is post Elvis. The Simpsons doesn't seem subversive anymore because they've been on the air for 30 years. And so to go back and understand how is it that Kirby is different requires you to be immersed in what was before, and then you can see the radical break in a Kirby, in an Eisner, in a Steranko, in anyone that we want to make a claim, radically push the aesthetics forward. And so we're really kind of immersed in these typical comics, these kind of very boring, very like unremarkable. What was fascinating to me is it randomly generated no kind of key comics. We didn't get any Fantastic Four #1 or, Detective Comic, the first appearance of Batman, all these things that would have been really expensive. We got Fantastic Four #11, and it's sort of these run-of-the-mill, fairly banal things, but looking at the banality of them allows us to then think, well, how does Eisner get picked out as this incredible transformative figure? Or actually, how does someone like Barks get picked out? Because when you look at Barks, his layouts, his story lengths, his page designs, all very typical of the genre he was working at. So there's something else going on in Barks. There's the quality of the writing, the quality of the line work, but there's something that fans were responding to, where he is the best of the typical artists rather than a kind of, a Steranko figure where you're just like, what the hell's going on here? This is very much a radical break from what came before
Yeah.
Well, I struggled as someone who's written about fandom off and on through a long period of time. I always dodged talking about collecting, right? Because I was most anxious about the public perception of fans as collecting worthless stuff. And I put that off until this project because I wasn't ready to tackle the question of how to deal with collecting at a deeper level. And I have to say, Lincoln, your book inspired me to dig deeper into that. And I'm curious your current thinking about collecting and meaning making. You've spent more time than any of us, I think, thinking about collecting.
Well, thanks for your kind words, Henry. Yeah, no, I in reverse, I suppose, because of that sort of distancing, as I was sort of working on my early work on fandom, discussions around fan practices, not a lot was being talked about or analyzed what I enjoyed doing, which was, collecting stuff. And I thought that the stories that come alongside the collections are what makes that a sort of rejuvenating, creative practice in a way. And what you pick up in your book, as I was reading, is clearly it's about the stories that are put alongside. So Bryan described all those instances where the masks were accumulated, or not collected, but accumulated. They came with, those personal stories, which make them very tangible and unique items. So whilst Bryan might have one of these Mardi Gras masks on his wall, this one comes attached with my story, or the fish above it. It's about, the sort of making that object tangible from the moment you pick it up in a store, even if it's mass produced, or unique, through to where you take it, and you describe that process in your book about the process of then, putting it in position and placing it within the collection, and if it's put on display, people ask you about it, then you get to recount the story. I think that is the sort of crucial part of collecting, that hopefully doesn't mark it with those stereotypes that you mentioned about the obsessive collector, the completist. I haven't got a complete collection of anything I'm into, but I've got the odd bit of this, I've got the odd bit of that. I suppose the only thing that now I'm retrospectively collecting, and this is just easy because it's mail order, is a series of Transformers collection of comics from the 80s and 90s that are being repackaged to put on my shelf in a nice display where the spines create a picture of Optimus Prime whooping the ass of Megatron. And I'm partly doing that so I can put it on display eventually on one giant shelf on my wall. And then when I'm retired, many years from now, if I can have that luxury, I'm going to sit down and read them all, because I just never had the time to do that. And so the collection for me is also an important job that is probably going to take a large chunk of my time and finances.
I'm curious if we could start to think about the gender dynamics of collecting and how some of the different artists we've kind of been talking about, or Henry talks about in this section of the book, differ on their representations of collections or what they choose to collect. So I was taken reading Henry's book with how many of Bryan's models were public collections, things like the Cabinet of the Curiosity, or the music hall tradition, or even doing an adaptation of a city, whereas someone like Emil Ferris using notebooks and journaling seems much more private. So I'm wondering if you could all speak to that while I bring up a still of Emil's work. And my favorite thing is monsters.
Yeah, if I could just
Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry, I just wanted to jump in really quickly and kind of give a shout out to uh, a former PhD student of mine, now Dr. Rachel Miller, who a lot of her work has been kind of about, her dissertation deals a lot with particularly women cartoonists and zine makers in the 90s and early 2000s, and the ways in which the girl's bedroom became a site of a kind of different kind of what we might call a cabinet of curiosity, a place for kind of sharing and connecting private collections through zine making and comics making. And I think there's a ton of kind of really exciting scholarship coming out from Rachel and some of her generation that is going to, I think, do a lot to both shine a light on the kind of traditions out of which Emil's work comes, but also kind of helping us recover a lot of the largely, I think, understudied work of women cartoonists in the 90s, which was an incredibly productive period, but a lot of that work wasn't kind of collected and saved in trade books. And so there's, I think, a whole world of kind of alternative kinds of collections and archiving that is kind of yet to be fully studied. And I'm hoping to kind of encourage her to get that dissertation into a book form as quickly as possible, because it's I think really connects nicely with the stuff Henry does here.
Yeah, I think it's no accident that this panel has ended up being pretty much all male speakers, and next week's panel is all female. It's a struggle. It's something I struggled with throughout writing the book, was how gendered the topics that these graphic artists dealt with, and the degree to which men had written art, had done stories around collecting and accumulation, and women around stories of inheritance, culling, cleaning. And it says something about the lives of both men and women that would be the case. But Emil is the interesting contrast in all of that, but in a paradoxical way, because she does talk about fan culture, she does talk about a deep investment of monsters, but as the title of the book suggests, monsters is a thing, not things, right? And I think the grammatical structure of that title tells us a lot, right? It's a concept, it's a domain, it's something she's interested in. But the more I looked at the panels in the book, how sparse the belongings of her protagonist, Karen, actually is there. She has very little monster stuff. And one of the few items of monster stuff she has is actually Dracula, which is her friend's passion, not her own. So it sort of tells us that it was a misguided gift, in effect. Often people give you things as gifts that they would like rather than what you would like. And I sort of see that image as really carefully chosen. I think what we're seeing here is one of the pivotal moments of the book where the concept of monsters opens up a space for thinking about sexuality in different terms. It scrambles the way these two girls think of their sexual identities, their relationships to each other. We're blurring between sort of female bonding at a slumber party and taking blood oaths with each other, with the scene of Dracula's daughter, which has often been identified as a queer text among the Universal horror films, which is one of the few which has a female monster and a female victim. And it's that moment she's evoking there. But it's evoked here as an image on the screen, as a memory, and then something she draws herself, a moment of transformation, not so much a moment of collecting and mapping one's meaning onto an item. And I think there's a kind of consistency of anti-materialism that runs through that book, where things are not available, but ideas, concepts, memories can be reproduced by the artist and put on the page.
It's also notable in that book too that so much of her collection and inspiration comes from another public space, which I didn't think about until now, which is the art museum, right? Where she goes and looks at paintings with these, and so many of the following pages afterwards take on the aesthetic of the various paintings she sees at the Chicago Art Institute. So I guess my question was, or my hypothesis is slightly incorrect in that, it's not all private, but there is this idea, to kind of double back off of what you're saying, that a lot of it's not hers.
But the way she talks about those paintings is that you can burrow in them and they become raw materials for your own fantasies. And the way she draws them, we see Ferris's ability to reproduce all those paintings, but transform to reflect what other people see when they look at them. So the moments where we see the transgender kid looking at paintings of women and becoming those painted figures, transforming them into his likeness, I think makes them both private and public spaces at the same time.
I think one of the things I've always been kind of fascinated with this book in relationship to kind of material culture and collecting is, and again, it's part of, I always am a little hesitant to say too much definitive about a book that I feel like I need to know what happens next.
Yes, so understood.
But I do find it kind of fascinating, as Drew points out, that the Chicago Art Institute is so central for both her and her brother, that they each transform those images in different ways. For Dee's, it's often it becomes tattoos, becomes something that is kind of that he like physically embodies. For her, it's obviously the sketchbook, but also, of course, the performances of kind of fantasies. But she is also, somebody who is kind of, again, kind of coming back to Bryan's point about being an accumulator rather than a collector. She is, randomly borrowing from, as you pointed out, from so many different source materials, from different media, from, that would have been available to her in the kind of fictional time in which this is set, including not just comics, of course, but especially the kind of horror and monster magazines that were a big part of my own childhood as well, to the kind of movies that were being broadcast on television, often from the past, movies like some of the Frankenstein movies, and from, as well, the kind of performative kind of popular culture of the streets of Chicago, that she also is a kind of, I don't want to say voyeur, but certainly a kind of flaneur who is kind of experiencing and incorporating all of these stimuli and making out of it a kind of giant collage. And that's that kind of way in which the book itself feels as much like a scrapbook that is kind of assembled from all the different material and immaterial forms of popular culture that kind of go into kind of making up the raw material of her coming of age story. I find it just incredibly exciting. I think it's different. It's obviously, and I think gender and sexuality has a lot to do with those differences, but I think there are more continuities perhaps between what Ferris is doing and what Seth is doing that might be at first kind of fully visible. I think she is, to some degree, because, and Ferris is interesting, right? She comes very much from outside the world of comics. Like, she was not part of that scene. She didn't grow up reading a lot of comics. She, part of what made her work such a revelation for so many of us when it came out was that it didn't look like, in almost any way, the kind of alt comics that we were kind of used to at the time. It just felt like it came out like a thunderbolt out of nowhere. And that's, I think, part of what's kind of interesting in terms of the kind of semi-autobiographical aspects of that book as well, is it's a kind of reminder of the kind of pastiche that literally made up her kind of coming of age narrative in relationship to pop culture, because of course that was a popular culture, particularly comics, that was often very exclusionary of girls and young women at the time in which she would have been growing up. Drew, I think you're muted. Did you say something?
I got it. Yep. Thank you. I was going to say, anyone else want to jump in on the discussion about Emil Ferris, gender and collection, or should we turn to the audience for a few questions?
Yeah, why don't we go to the audience?
Okay, Maria has a question that goes back to one of the first points of discussion we had, which was when considering comics and materiality and materialism, how does comic book merchandise fit into the picture? Does it affect production, publication, reception, and value? Bart, I felt like you hit on this a little bit, but is there anything else you'd want to add on that point?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think merchandise, you know, is a really important part of comics. I mean, when I talked in Comics versus Art about the comics world, I think it upset some people. They wanted to kind of carve off. And I was saying, well, no, comic book T-shirts are comics in a way. Like the stuff that is sold in comic book stores, comics, there's a whole discussion going on I see in the comments about Funko Pops and what their relationship might be, but it's clear that that's becoming an absolutely central part of the fandom and the way that that we understand comics and the way that they circulate and the ideas about them circulate now through all of this kind of subsidiary material. So that kind of gets written out a bit of my current project, but I mean, I'm fascinated by just some of the ways we have, strangely, I guess, like 6 3D comics that were sampled as the What Were Comics corpus, because in 1953 there was a huge run of 3D. I mean, it burned out very, very quickly, the fascination with 3D comics. But when you're buying them, the extra cost, if you want the actual Batman 3D glasses, drives the price of the comic book up sort of exponentially, partly because they're the type of thing that would get separated from the book and lost very easily. But to me, the idea that these comics were circulating with these glasses becomes really, really interesting, and trying to figure out exactly what those glasses look like and so on. It's a reminder that comics aren't just this thing that can be, you know, digitized, and aren't just these sort of physical objects that contain stories. They contain a lot more than simply stories.
Yeah, Billy just tweeted about, messaged about Alice Loper, which had, I mean, you can see it in the My Alice book. I've got it downstairs. This I came across as a jumble sale. It's this 19th century porcelain bust of Alice Loper, this comic character, and the hat actually comes off. You can keep things inside, you know, and it's not the only expression of him. I mean, they used to sell all sorts of little Alice Loper things in the 19th century. And a year or two ago, I was in York Museum, and there's a massive case, like an exhibition case, glass Victorian one. And you put, you know, where people put a penny in, and Alice Loper's there as a puppet and sings a song. And I tried to tell the museum who they didn't know. They didn't know what the character was. They just thought it was a, you know, Victorian thing. And I got in touch with Roger Sabin, who's a big British comic expert, but he's a big expert also on Alice Loper. He didn't know about this. So the next day, I think he was on a train going up to York to see this thing. But yeah, Alice Loper had lots of merchandising. His character first published in 1915 in the Daily Mail, because nobody's heard of it these days, called Teddy Tail.
Oh yeah.
Have you heard of Teddy Tail?
Because of you.
Oh, right. Yeah. But he, I mean, he was massive. He's, 1915, he was in print till about 1960 with annuals and things like that. And he was a mouse. But he was absolutely massive. I mean, there were songs sung about him on radio, on BBC Radio. There was the club. There was stuffed toys. There was, you could buy mugs with his. There's a membership club. It was a household word, household name. And now, you know, in Britain, you mentioned Teddy Tail to anybody, nobody's heard of them at all. It's how fleeting his fame, you know.
Yeah, I think it was the lecture that you gave on anthropomorphism and kind of.
Oh, I mentioned him in that. Yes, that's
Granville. Right. Yeah. It was a fantastic lecture. I've seen you give it a number of times. But one of the things when we're talking about collecting and stuff is one of the things that's, well, it's not about collecting per se, because I have a tendency to want to become a completionist, and I have to be careful of that because I have poor impulse control. I blame that on the fact that I'm on the spectrum, but it might just be the fact that I have poor impulse control. And I had discussions last week with Joan and people on here, and I ended up spending £100 afterwards on books that I didn't have, thanks to Nick Susanis as well. Having discussions on Twitter today with Bart and Martin Lund, spent £200 on comics and academic books. So it's not, but the one thing that I've noticed about myself, and I'm sure other people have their own experiences, especially Lincoln might be able to tap into this, is about the hunt. It's the hunt that is the big thing. So for quite some time, I've been looking for Howard the Duck #1. I just want it because I couldn't get it, and I got it last week. The reason why I haven't got it before is it ends up being too expensive on eBay. It goes to a silly amount, and I'm out. And because no one was bidding on this. Sorry?
How much, if you don't mind?
Well, sometimes it was going above £100, and but sometimes if someone doesn't bid on it, and I'm watching it, and there's like a minute left, and they've set it at $14.99, I'm like, and last week I got it for $14.99.
Wow.
When it arrived today, I opened it. I did my usual thing. I sniffed it and did. I mean, I said it was almost fetishistic last week, and Henry says there's no almost about it. But the point is, now that I've got it, I don't care about it.
Yeah. What are you going to do with it?
The hunt's over.
Yeah.
Like a dog chasing a car, huh? It's
Yeah.
But yeah, the difference between the hunt and the search is something that I suggest in the book. Distinguishes Seth, who's obsessed with the hunt, and Kim Deesh, who's obsessed with the search, right? And they're very different modes of thinking about how you collect and pull things together and what an accomplishment is in terms of collecting. But I was going to go back to what Bryan was just talking about. On the edge of the USC campus, there's a car dealership that has the iconography of Felix the cat, from its sign down to a statue in the lobby. And it turns out this was licensed from the comics artists and animators in the teens, and has persisted through all of these years as a functioning car dealership. And I suspect most people driving down Figueroa today have no idea that that's a cartoon character from the teens, or what the material culture of that would be. But it's a reminder of just the proliferation of material objects around early comics, which is precisely what inspires Kim Deesh to create Waldo the Cat and to explore the weight of that accumulated culture on future generations.
Yeah,
Yeah, Jared,
doesn't go away, you know.
Oh, sorry. Jared, I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit. Oh, yeah. Jared, did you want to talk a little bit about that? I liked your two metaphors of data mining and dumpster diving that Henry draws on when he's looking at Seth and Deutsch's work.
Yeah, I mean, I at the risk of repeating just a tad of what I said before, is that I do think the kind of the kind of combination of the search and the hunt is kind of vital, right? That is, there is, the hunt for something in particular. I mean, I think it's important that so many of Seth's examples are, of course, fictional, right? That he's he's not, of course, engaged in his kind of fictional autobiographical stand-in, is not engaged in a hunt for something that actually exists. It's got its own level of kind of self-referential and even self-critical humor to it, if we're thinking about It's a Good Life. But there's the kind of need to combine the hunt, and we've all, as particularly those of us who've engaged in research, as all of us have, as scholars and as artists, looking for a reference for a particular panel or for a particular source that will help us make sense of what a writer or artist was engaged in. We know about the importance of that hunt. We also know that often that hunt also leads to all kinds of other discoveries and rabbit holes. And one of the things that I think is important that comes up in the discussion of Seth in Henry's book is the reminder that a lot of these cartoonists we're talking about are cartoonists who grew up in a pre-digital era, where it's not that everything, despite our fantasies, is instantly accessible today, but we have a fantasy that we can get all the information in the world if we just get the right search terms. For Seth's generation, which, you know, for those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s in the pre-digital age, finding things involved a lot of luck, intuition, inspiration, looking in unlikely places. It's almost, I mean, I grew up before, I came to comics before comic book shops were ubiquitous. And even after comic book shops started to rise, none of them had complete runs in the throughout most of the 70s. By the time they started to have complete runs in the 80s and early 90s, they were already becoming too expensive for a lot of collectors to gain access to. And so I think that kind of nostalgia actually that a lot of these works describe, including Chris Ware's, is a nostalgia for a kind of pre-digital era of the kind of material hunt, like, you know, like Catcher's protagonist, who is hunting through the streets of New York for this lost New York, this lost mythical New York that lies just under the grime or under the table. Something that it required actually going out and hunting flea markets and yard sales and looking for in unlikely places, and sometimes discovering the thing you wanted, and sometimes discovering, we see this in I think Kim Deitch's work in particular, sometimes discovering all this other cool stuff you didn't even know existed, these new obsessions that will lead you, and this is the kind of narratives that shape so much of Kim's work, that lead you down all kinds of new rabbit holes that you never expected to go down. I mean, I think that pleasure is something they're kind of recovering, and it shapes literally their narratives. These are narratives about research, research that also involved exploring cities, you know, whether that city is Toronto or Montreal or New York or wherever, but they involve a kind of archaeology and anthropology that is incredibly physical and material, and exciting, and definitely pre-digital.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Will Straw said last week on the session that really struck me was that, you know, now that he's given up record collecting, when he goes to a new city, he doesn't know what to do with himself, right? Because you would go to Mexico City and so, well, where do I go to find this kind of music? Where do I go to Paris? I go to wherever, Cape Town, I'm going to find these things. And so for people who collect comics or old paperbacks or music or whatever, you navigate a city based on those logics. And I took my son to New York for the first time about a year ago, and we're showing him some places, but I was like, I don't really need to go, you know, like St. Mark's Books and St. Mark's Comics, which is a place that, you know, was sort of mythical to me. I once found a copy of Rubber Blanket #2 and St. Mark's Comics in a bin at the back. You know, they both closed now, and I was like, well, it's sad, but on the other hand, I wasn't going there. And the video stores and so on that map a kind of relationship to a city. I can tell you where every comic book store is in Paris. I navigate London by the comic book stores. And when Gosh moved from the British Museum to its current location, I was like, what's going on now? I can't find my way to it anymore, because I know where to go buy things, and I'm not buying them in the same ways anymore. Becomes this kind of fascinating transformation when we're not hunting and searching in the way that Seth and Deitch and others describe, and in the way that Henry talks about in the book.
Joan had asked the question earlier in the chat about the linkage between comics as advertising and transmedia companions, and kind of thinking about the relationship between comics and storyboards. I know, like, Art Spiegelman has been very dismissive of this and says that, you know, there is no comparison of the two. You can't make that equation. But I was really interested by the question because something interesting happened in the last, I want to say it came out in the last 3 months, which was they took Parasite the movie, the storyboards, and they reauthored them as a graphic novel that they ended up selling to bookstores, and that has come out And a lot of cinephiles I know in my circle have really been appreciative of this. So I'm curious to see if this kind of brings up any new ideas in how we might think about this analogy of comics and storyboards, because I've always kind of looked at storyboards personally as a technical diagram, that it takes a certain kind of expertise to know how to read what a camera movement does or what focal length of the lens, and how we kind of turn something that's more of a schematic into something that's narrative material.
So,
I also wanted to,
sorry.
I just wanted to add a little bit of more context to that in terms of, like I got the opportunity to study with Alex McDowell here, and he did the production design for the Watchmen movie, and some of his designs are basically shot for shot remakes of panels in that. And I've also noticed that in the Marvel Cinematic Universe lately, is there are a lot of moments when they use a sort of bullet time to show you that they are animating a panel. Particularly, I have permanently etched in my mind the image of Iron Man shooting his blasters at Captain America's shield as a full page splash page that in the film also looked like a splash page.
Yeah, I think storyboards can be beautiful. So I mean, it's like an Alan Moore script. It depends who's doing the script. So a storyboard can be as detailed as a comic. But I remember when the first episode of The Walking Dead came out on AMC, there was a lot of discourses around how the comic itself was the storyboard. And it really upset a lot of people, a lot of comic scholars, they were just coming out and saying, no, different thing, different communication medium. Stop saying that. The comic is the art. And then we're back to the idea of valuation and all the stuff that Bart's talked about so brilliantly in his work in Comics versus Art and the book that he did with Benjamin Wu. So I just think it's interesting that in the pursuit to have comics recognized as a legitimate art form, I think that we're sometimes stuck, and by we I mean the royal we, stuck in kind of like, so when we ask how we would define comic, if we were meeting today to talk about film, we wouldn't be defining film. We wouldn't be defining television. But all the time we get the same type of questions, don't we? Like, what's the difference between a storyboard and a comic? And to say that a storyboard isn't a comic works to elevate the comic book itself. I guess that's what I'm saying. And that work's still going on. And and I'm really looking forward to your new book that comes out next week, Bart, which is kind of an overview of comic studies that you did with Charles Hatfield. Is that right?
Well, it's an edited collection. Yeah, it's
okay. So this side, like, we need to sometimes I think we need to start moving forwards now. Like, do we really need to have the discussion about whether comics are for adults or for kids? Are we not? This was a discourse in the 1980s. It was a heavy discourse. It was popular, but I still see in entertainment journalism, comics are not just for adults anymore. And I'm like,
Yes.
We get that headline once a summer for like the 30 years. That's how it's always been.
Oh, there's a great article in the Onion which says a new article come out that was really interesting that said comics are not for kids anymore. Said no one 110,000 times. And it's kind of like comic, and I'm not just talking about comic studies, I'm talking about comic fans and audience as well. There seems to be this need to defend the medium before we even talk about it at all. So, and I think that's really interesting in the beginning of Henry's book. It really hit me. When we're talking about, when Henry, when you're talking about the graphic novels that reached the New York Times bestseller list, and there's no superheroes. I find that fascinating because comic books are so much more than superheroes. And I say that as someone who loves superheroes as much as the next person. And I think I'm going off on a tangent a lot, but I'm kind of thinking there still seems to be this need to defend the object of study.
Well, in fairness, television studies went through that phase for the first half of my career, where everyone had to justify that they were studying television. Today, I think you would be back in definitional discussions around television because of the squishy and permeable boundaries between film and television, particularly this year, make it harder and harder to decide what is cinema, what is television, where does television start and stop and the digital begins. And so to some degree, it's because comics are a moving object right now, because they're in transition, that this definitional question is asked, as much as because of cultural hierarchies. And television studies, I think, can navigate both of those things over the 40 years that I've been involved in studying television.
I also think
good point.
I
And
also
as
think
somebody-
video games went I'm gonna plow through. Video games went through a very similar trend, and I always think about the two as interconnected, because I know, Henry, you testified before Congress about comics, right? And
No,
then-
video games more.
Video
most-
games.
yes.
Okay, so Dimitri Williams, who's another professor at USC Annenberg, also testified in that. So it's, I don't know, for me, it feels like this immediate connection to history. And I've noticed that that sort of growth period, that like phenomenon of here's the new media, here's a huge backlash, conservative against it, saying that it's trash and it's corrupting children's minds. Here's a backlash against it, saying that it's causing us to lose the ability to communicate with each other. Now we're going to talk about whether or not it really counts as art. And then we're finally going to start having academic discussions about it.
I was going to say, as someone who wrote a dissertation about comic books throughout the, late 2000, it was 2008 to 2012, I constantly had to justify what I was doing. For folks in media studies, it was weird. There weren't a lot of comic book panels at SCMS or anything. And unfortunately, this is probably going to bring us back to the rather depressing point that we had discussion before we actually opened up the room, which is I think it's dangerous to think that we're done advocating for this. We don't have a lot of comic studies departments. We don't have a lot of comic studies hires, right? So
and we're not going to get them, right? I mean,
yeah, no, especially now.
I mean, one of the challenges that we face as a field, but I think it's also an opportunity, right, is that, you know, when comic studies started to move into more visibility within the academy, a lot of folks, particularly of my generation, were kind of looked back to film studies as a model, like, oh, this is gonna follow the path of film studies. We will kind of start just making film programs and hires. And of course, film studies in the United States is a post-GI Bill phenomenon. Comic studies is the opposite, right? This is a contracting academy as opposed to a dramatically expanding academy. But I also think that gives us some great opportunities, right? Comic studies, by definition, requires an incredible range of interdisciplinary approaches. For better or worse, those of us in the humanities and adjacent areas are going to probably end up corralled into larger units, potentially even in my lifetime, certainly in the lifetimes of younger scholars who are here today. And there's a lot of bad things about that. Don't get me wrong, but I think for comic studies, there's some good things about it too, right? If we are sitting side by side across the office from art historians and communication scholars and folklorists and folks who are kind of teaching and working in multiple languages, some of the dangerous provincialism that I think has surrounded a lot of film studies and the way in which it defined and created itself, I think is something we can avoid. And it's something that can lead to, you know, the potential for doing kind of genuine kind of lab-based collaborative work that I think comic studies needs for its next stage of evolution, one that brings together folks from a wide range of fields and approaches. Because, you know, I think it's one of the things that I think we all would agree on is that and I know this is something that Bart agrees on, is that the dominance of English professors in comic studies has not been on the whole a great thing for comic studies. Not because English professors are bad, but because they read everything as if it were a novel, right? Their training historically has been to kind of look for recognizable objects. And so I do think there are some, as just to try and not slip into the darkness with which we began before we opened up the doors, but to try and point to something that's potentially good. We're not going to become film studies. We're not going to have departments of comic studies in any meaningful sense across, at least across the Anglophone academic world. But I think there are potential opportunities for us to do something special with comics through the kinds of collaborations that we'll have.
There is a movement in that direction, though, and I mean, I'm trying to be positive because Jared did say thanks for the depression conversation when we started, and it was more realistic, yeah. But so especially in Scotland and the UK, I mean, we have Chris Murray now, who famously or infamously, whatever, he's the first professor in comic studies. Now that says a lot, really, the first one. But at the same time, I agree with you, Jared, about it's not that English professors should or shouldn't be doing it. It's because it's a different approach and things like that. And I think we've seen an explosion in the Anglo-American world in the past 10 years around master's degrees in comic studies and the PhDs and the amount of. I mean, when I started my PhD in 2000, sorry, when I was doing an undergraduate in the mid-noughties, there was hardly anything really around comics that much compared to now. So I think it's very positive in where we're going, and I do agree with what you're all saying around, and especially with what Henry's saying around definition and stuff. I think it was just my idea of having to defend the object of study. You don't defend your object of study in comics and stuff, for example, Henry. You just study it.
No, I pointedly chose not to defend my object of study and just assert that battle, as far as I'm concerned, is over. And that is not to do service to the advocacy for a field, which I think still needs to be done. But if we spend the first third of every book on comics apologizing and defending our object of study, we're not going to make any conceptual progress at all. I think we have to move beyond that, and the way cinema studies move beyond it at a certain point. And most television studies books today don't start with the colonial whinge, that they start with a step toward, simply discussing television as something that we accept as worthy of study. So I think I'm ready to say we shouldn't keep legitimizing the medium. We should demand respect and not beg for it. But that is a different context than if I'm fighting within a university for a hire or trying to advocate for a graduate student whose work I think is significant but is focused on comics. I think that's a different thing than how I write in a book, where I'm trying to get into the meat of the matter as quickly as I can. But then I was impatient with that early preliminary conversations, this book all along, and I'm intrigued at how much people want to talk about the first chapter of the book, which to me, I thought I was just recapping things there that the field already absorbed, at least intuitively, and acted on, but that I was finding when I talked to non-comics audience, I had to go back and say, yes, there are superhero comics, they're different from this. Yes, they're Japanese comics, they're different from American comics, all of that traffic cop stuff. Had, when I'd open up to questions after a talk, I'd be hit with all of that before I could get to anything that was unique of what I was saying. And I find that frustrating. So I just gave myself permission to say, here's X number of pages. I'm going to say this. It's going to bore the hell out of anyone who knows anything about comics. But if we get through that, then we can get on to the new stuff and move forward. And it's the second half of the chapter now that in comic studies, everyone wants to talk about. But that's, laying the foundations is what enables discussions to take place. But it shouldn't be done in an apologetic way. I say, as someone who's been there for the opening of television studies and game studies and comic studies. I've been through these battles multiple times now, and the only way they end well is just to move forward with the assumption that we can write what we want to write and that it justifies itself if it's good, and if it's not good, no amount of justification in the intro is going to allow us to get away with a crappy book.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I'm not principal lecturer in comics is for many of those reasons. It's comics, film, and transmedia. And transmedia is very buzzy these days, as you know, but I would be very reluctant to call myself a lecturer in comics because I do more than that. And I think most of us do, if not everyone. But yeah, so you articulated it much better than I could, and it's the idea that instead of defending, the work should speak for itself, I guess. Yeah.
I'll turn to Joan for what might be our last question. Joan, you had kind of threw out a couple questions, so I'll ask you to personally ask it, and it'll probably go towards Jared, I would assume. It's about how we are archiving comics and what kinds of decisions are being made on that front about how we're scanning them, how do you deal with old microfiche, these kinds of things. So Joan, did you want to try to ask that question a little more cohesively than I can?
It was a discussion with several people in the comments as the sort of discussion of materiality was happening. We were kind of having this sub discussion about how you archive something that, for example, has a comic book on the spine. Like I think one was mentioned right after I showed the Chris Ware book, and one commenter remarked that there are some ways of doing 3D archiving where you can actually, physically turn the book around and look at it from all angles, kind of like if you've ever shopped for a car online. And
British Museum does some of that, yeah.
Yeah, I think that was mentioned. Also, there was the sort of question that brings up is how much value do we put into archiving these comics, and do we need a special type of archivist for the materiality of comics? So that was just kind of throwing all that out there.
It's important. I mean, there's so many challenges right now because I work very closely with the curators at the Billy Ireland and with other comics archivists. And there's so many kind of challenges facing the field right now, obviously. One of the big problems for now is like, what do we do with the papers of cartoonists whose papers are all digital? Are they gonna give us their Gmail account? So we have really fundamental questions like that. Of course, a lot of the kind of work that we used to collect, we still collect. A lot of it is digital processes now. How do we collect that? Do we ask them to preserve layers? Nobody's going to change their work processes, imagining that their work might be collected one day. By the time they realize that, that ship has probably sailed. And then there's the other issue you raised for comics, which is digital archiving of analog material, which is also trapped and surrounded by so many copyright problems. We're lucky that the tragedy of post 1955 happened, in a sense, because as Bart said, it gave us a whole world of comics that did not have their copyrights renewed. Companies went out of business, copyrights weren't renewed, and we were able to then create these publicly accessible archives like Comic Book Plus. But those are the exceptions, as valuable as they are. And so it's very hard, for example, for us at the Billy Ireland to make a lot of materials accessible digitally because getting permissions is hard. And we're realizing how urgent that is right now, right? The pandemic has made it really clear as we can't open the doors to people to do research, we're seeing the real limits. We've gotten several inquiries from classes who want to know, how can students browse comics digitally? And even on the basic level, we're seeing how big those gaps are. So there's a lot of work, both for scholars, but also for the public, right? For a growing number of young people who want access to comics, very few of which are available digitally through their public libraries. And with many public libraries still closed, this is presenting shows some real weaknesses in our field, both on the publishing and distribution, and as we've seen with Diamond's challenges, but also on the side of archiving and libraries and collections. So I'm hoping that some good lessons will come out of this experience of the pandemic, and we will kind of work together with publishers and libraries, public and academic, and do a better job at collecting and disseminating this information. We're weak on the dissemination.
So on the subject of comics and libraries, I have to share a story that I was researching at the Library of Congress a couple of years back and pulled up Dennis the Menace Goes to Washington, D.C., where Henry Mitchell is explaining to his son that the Library of Congress has a copy of every book printed in the United States, meaning to impress him. And Dennis's response was, wow, imagine how many comics they must have. And Henry sort of flips out and they go stomping off and so forth. It's one of the kind of naive punchlines. But I'm sitting reading this comic in the collection of the Library of Congress, which I think is the only thing maybe that rivals the Billy Ireland collection in the U.S.
Well, for comic books, the Billy Ireland is not strong. I mean, their Michigan State is the real strength for looking at comic books themselves. We tend to be representative examples for comic books. Library of Congress and Michigan State, I think, are the two best comic book collections. Maybe somebody can correct me if they know of other stronger ones.
So it was just very amusing to me to see that the idea, the absurdity at the time that Library of Congress would have a collection of comic books, and the revenge of Dennis the Menace.
British Museum, British
Yeah.
Library, sorry.
British Library
Victoria
does.
Albert as well.
Any last final questions from our audience? No? Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. Oh, sorry. What were you going to say?
I was just going to toss out some food for thought. Last time I left thinking, I was thinking about the idea of the essays with 5 comics. And I started to think about what I've just sort of called uncomics, because I have a lot of pieces in my home that are tabletop role-playing rule books or video game strategy guides or things like that that are full of illustration, clearly at times desire to tend to tell the story of what's going on. So I just thought maybe it's something to chew on for a little while.
Thanks for that. Well, next week on Tuesday at the same bat time on the same bat channel, we've got Rebecca Wanzo, Hillary Shute, Joyce Farmer, and I believe Mary Talbot's going to join us. So if you're interested in that final discussion, it'll be next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. You can find all the details on Henry's site, henryjenkins.org. You can RSVP there. And yeah, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thanks to Joan and Amanda for taking care of some of the backdoor administrative stuff. And yeah, we hope to see you then.
Take care.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.